listening to the Astral Hour. I'm your host, Astral Meadow. Join me as we take a glimpse into the mysterious. Welcome, everyone. Today I'm joined once again with my husband, Justin. This will be part one of a two-part series focused around the Hermetic Principles and the Kybalion. In this first part, we will be discussing some of the history on where the Hermetic Principles originate and give a little background on the author of this book, while also exploring Hermeticism in general. In part two, we will be discussing each principle individually and find relatable ways to work with these principles and how to connect with them in a deeper way. Welcome to the show.
Thanks. I'm happy to be back. I've really enjoyed studying for this episode, as I have all of the ones I've been on so far. And of course, I guess indirectly, I study with you on all subjects, which is awesome. I enjoy that too. But I've really enjoyed digging into Hermeticism and the Hermetic Principles. And I find that I resonate with it, and it's probably what I believe at this point as well. So
I feel like for you specifically, it's important because as a Gemini rising, your chart ruler is Mercury. So as we have explored some of this, mercurial wisdom, I feel like it actually has benefited you in more ways than even someone that maybe doesn't have Mercury in such a powerful position in their chart.
I could definitely see that. I've always been a little drawn towards Mercury and that whole vibe. Communication in general, I've always enjoyed, but
yeah,
it's been fascinating to study along, and especially learn more about Hermes and Thoth and all of these characters. It's just right up my alley.
Or Thoth.
Thoth.
Before we get started,
that's true.
Before we get started, there's this funny thing when working with Hermes, because he is quite the trickster. And it's funny because with the word Thoth, I'm telling you, I've probably heard at least 6 different pronunciations of that word. And everyone that uses this word seems to think that theirs is the correct way. But honestly, we don't really know because some of the language has been lost over time. So I think it's all, valid. And with the word Trismegistus, which we'll also go into later, some people say Trismegistus. I mean, it's just funny with all this, the word play, and it's kind of you almost have to just put your ego aside and be like, whatever happens, whatever we say is meant to be said that way, and not overanalyze just the phonetics of the name Thoth.
Right. Well, I mean, we watched that video with that rabbi professor, and he broke down the name, and it was like a 20-minute video of him explaining. And by the end, he was like, so in conclusion, nobody really knows how it's pronounced. So It could be any of them and all of them, and it's all acceptable. We're like, okay. Well, it's
all just semantics.
Yeah.
Okay. So I guess we need to
Your
talk
preference.
about why we're talking about Hermes and Thoth and all of that. So
yeah, so I guess we'll start at the beginning. It's always the best place. So what exactly is Hermeticism? What are we talking about?
All right, so Hermeticism is a philosophical and religious system. It's based on the teachings of Hermes Trismegistus, and is a Hellenistic blending of the Greek god Hermes and the Egyptian god Thoth. So towards the end of the Egyptian era and leading into more of that Greco-Roman influence, these two deities got synchronized together, which is actually something that happens a lot over the course of history, because it's just a natural part of our evolution. All dynasties have a beginning and an ending, but the information that we gathered through that time period isn't fully lost as it sort of merges and evolves into that next phase. these teachings contain the various writings attributed to Hermes, known as the Hermetica, which was produced between 300 BCE and 1200 CE. It can also refer to a wide variety of philosophical systems, which generally are associated with Hermes. So, Hermes Trismegistus, let's talk about him just a little bit.
It's an awesome name.
So I asked the records because there is so much that's sort of veiled with this character. And, a lot of people are like, was this person even real? With a lot of myths, we know that we don't always have to take myths as fact, that they are living stories and there's hidden wisdom within them. Okay. So for this, I actually relied on the records to answer my question, because if I ask this question on the internet, I get all sorts of convoluted, funny, cool things, which is just merging, information on Thoth and Hermes, which we'll go into both of those deities a little bit more here soon. But so the records, I asked, who is Hermes Trismegistus? And they answered, similar to King Arthur, there are many legends and myths that have been passed down over time. This character has evolved beyond his original form and continues to work with humanity from beyond the earth plane. He has taken multiple forms over time, hint the thrice great. These different incarnations have been syncretized and blended into a singular concept, but can be understood deeper by also studying his main incarnations separately, being Moses, Thoth, and Hermes. So this was interesting because I didn't really know the Moses thing, but it made more sense when I was thinking about him and the Ten Commandments and the tablets and, literally channeling the wisdom of the spiritual realm down into the earth plane, right? Which makes so much sense. Going on, all of these figures have made a huge impact on humanity over time. The legends have glamorized him, but such is necessary for his story to be passed down and remembered. So then I asked, is he connected to the planet Mercury? And they said yes. Before his Earth incarnations, he spent much time mastering the mercurial energy, which he was to bring down into the Earth plane. There are various beings who have done this with all the planetary energies. It's as if they are a full embodiment of the planet manifested in a physical form. There have been many of these incarnations and their stories lost over time, but some remain deeply ingrained within the collective consciousness. So I was like, whoa, that's really cool. When we work with the records, we get even more of a bigger picture.
Right.
Of sort of like the beyond energy too. Like not just, these are historical facts, but this is like bigger than that. Right. It's bigger than just saying, okay, on this date, this book was written and it covered this. It's like, this is like a grand story.
Right.
So, yeah. Also with Hermes, like the thrice great could refer to his mastery over the three planes, which would be physical, mental, and spiritual. He combined the knowledge of these planes, and he acts as a bridge between the material and the divine. So when we're studying like these myths, some of the things that Thoth and Hermes have in common, like one of the big things is the psychopomp role, which is helping souls to be able to cross over. They're able to go into the underworld. They're able to go into the heavens, the above, the below. And they act as like a messenger between these realms. And not all of the deities can do that. So this is actually a special role that they have specifically. There is a goddess, Iris, who is also sort of a feminine form of this psychopomp role. Right. So
I always picture Hermes as the animated version from Disney's Hercules.
Yeah, it's hard to get that out of your head.
It's hard.
But it is a caricature. Like he has
like
his winged helmet, he has those winged shoes, he has the caduceus. So, if that's your intro into like visualizing him, then that's cool.
Yeah. And, he's a trickster, and so he does have kind of a little attitude about him, I think. But as we found, it's usually it's always for your benefit, for your good. And so even though he might seem like a trickster or like doing stuff that's bothering you, it actually turns out to be for your best interest.
Yeah. I kind of love his trickster role, and it has manifested in a lot of other forms. So I think about Loki a lot when I think of the trickster form. We also have tricksters in like Native American mythologies and things like that, and I think all of this is the same.
Well, that was when we
being.
were talking to the records. They said that it's the same being that the Native Americans referred to as coyote, and they used that word and that term.
Right, with his silly stories. But something I've noticed in a lot of these myths is that these tricks bring about the necessary like tools or materials that this person needed that they wouldn't have had this trick not been played on them.
Right.
So like Thor wouldn't have had his hammer without Loki playing tricks on him. I also think about, if you think about the birth of Hermes, just I think it's 5 days after he's born, he's already playing tricks on his brother with the whole cattle myth. But to make up for it, he gives him the lyre, thus bringing music into existence. So how cool, that his little trick, brings about that. And so as much as it's easy to sort of fall into like, I don't know, kind of wanting to curse Mercury sometimes because you're like, stop playing these tricks on me. If we can take a few steps back, we can see where sometimes we are taking things too seriously, or sometimes we're on a path that isn't leading to the place that would be best for our soul unfoldment. So he's going to detour that and help you get back onto the path. So sometimes it seems like, oh, he set me up.
Right.
But usually if you give it some time, you can kind of laugh with him. He's very witty. He's very funny a lot of times, and find the humor in it and say thank you, right? Because I really did need a new computer. So thank you for,
Right.
That crash during the last Mercury retrograde.
And even though it was super inconvenient, I'm actually in a better spot now
Right.
than I was before.
Right.
Because my old computer would glitch or this or that.
Right, because we might have been too attached to something.
Yeah.
And it wasn't, it might have actually been making life more difficult. And we might have not moved on because we were so connected to, the idea of this thing going a certain way, or like overly connected to an object or something that might be, removed, and then something better can come in to fill its place. So, Hermes is the son of Zeus. This is some things I noticed which would be different with Hermes and Thoth, is that Thoth is sort of self-born. Some myths say he was born out of the lips of Ra at the beginning of creation. And this would make him known as like the god without the mother. And in a different story, he is self-created at the beginning of time, and as the ibis lays the cosmic egg that holds all creation. But even though as Hermes, he has a mom, I think it's Mia, and Zeus, he has parents. And he is the brother to Apollo. But in the Egyptian myth, he is self-created, but he's still deeply associated with Ra and the concept of divine order and justice. So even though the myths come across differently, there's still this play between, the sun and Mercury. So in the Egyptian mythology, Thoth is associated with the moon. He's the god of the moon, which is very interesting because I feel like that particular detail gets lost. Like he evolves out of that. So in astrology, Mercury is never more than 28 degrees from the sun. They're very much like interconnected within that realm as well. So it's kind of cool that it carries over into all these different myths, which is this relationship between the sun and Hermes or Thoth.
I think
so. They're deeply connected across history.
I think Mercury is probably one of the clearest depictions of a planet and its, godlike personified counterpart, because Mercury's right up, little small thing right next to the sun. It's just zipping around, flying around the sun real quick,
Right.
compared to all the other planets, which are much bigger, much slower. And here's this heavenly body that's just zipping around, and it totally makes sense. It totally matches up with his personification.
Right. And when we think of thought, I mean, it's like an instant, right? We have a thought. It seems to come out of nowhere. It's so quick. And then sometimes it can leave just as quick as it came. And so this is sort of the flightiness, the quickness of thought. So we look at these things, and we'll study this when we look at some of the principles, as above, so below. So we can look at this deity as something in the sky, as above us, as some great scheme playing out in the heavens, but it's also as below within us. And so Mercury is very much a part of us, because every time we have a thought, like that, we are vibrating at that same frequency. And so we have it within us. So these thoughts, when thoughts arise, where does it, that's mercurial energy that is connecting, traveling through the nervous system, giving us these fleeting ideas, giving us inspiration, giving us the ability to communicate our thoughts, giving us the ability to reason and absorb the wisdom around us. Mercury is also associated with writing. So all the poetry, writing music, writing fiction, telling stories, all of that is connected with Mercury. So when studying the Hermetic texts, they are usually divided into two categories. We have the philosophical side, which focuses mostly on the philosophy and ideas, and then the technical side, which is going to have more of a focus on things like alchemy, magic, potions, and astrology. The Kybalion would be more of an example of like the philosophical aspect. It's filled with a bunch of axioms. There's lots of, kind of mental exercises within it that you can utilize to understand it in that way. And then with this technical side, we have all sorts of fun stuff of like, how can we actually work with this? Tangible ways to work with it. And one of the big guys that I really love to study and talk about, who is very much into both sides of viewing this, would be Ficino. So Ficino lived from 1433 to 1499. He was an Italian scholar and a Catholic priest. He was one of the most influential humanist philosophers of the early Renaissance. He was also an astrologer, reviver of Neoplatonism, and the first to translate Plato's work into Latin. Ficino is such an interesting character to me, because he's literally a priest. He's like ingrained into the church, but he's like obsessed with magic. He's like really into astrology. He really wants to study this ancient wisdom, because he actually believed that it was sort of the origin of Christianity. That these, they're called Serapis priests. We can get into the whole cult of Serapis. Had actually predicted the birth of Jesus. And you think about like the Magi. I mean, those are magicians, right? And
yeah,
so
that
he
gets
was
overlooked a
he
lot.
was starting to see like that there was this interconnection with some of this wisdom that was coming out of Egypt that actually correlated with some of the Christian texts. So he actually tried to sort of like merge the two together. And, I think it worked for him. I think he was able to make enough connections to make it work. Let's talk for a minute about the Cult of Serapis. So the Cult of Serapis is something that comes out of Egypt. It is based around the death of Osiris. It's a wisdom cult, and it's very similar to the Jesus, because when we look at this Osiris myth, is he was killed by his brother, and then Thoth works with Isis to help revive him and bring him back. That's very much like Jesus, being resurrected. Okay, so there's like already a similarity right there. The So this allowed Ficino to sort of look at, okay, Christianity was just a slightly modified continuation of this Serapis cult. He believed that John the Baptist and Jesus were priests of this cult. And it's very interesting that John the Baptist was Florence's patron saint, which is the city that he was based around in.
And this is Ficino that believed that John the
right,
Baptist
and I wanted
Jesus
to
were.
read this.
That's interesting.
Okay, so here's a little section that I just found so interesting. This is an article written by Philip Copens. It's titled "The Corpus Hermeticum," which is one of the books that Ficino translated into Latin. Okay, he was responsible for that. Anyways, in this article, it talks about the Serapis cult. So it should be noted that they had nothing against Jesus, who they after all considered to have been a Serapist priest. Their problem was with what had become of his church and its dogma, which was not in line with Jesus or the Serapist teaching. Rather than a wisdom cult, Christianity was a dogmatic cult. So I think they noticed this. I think that they were devout, but I think they started noticing it as they were spending all this time studying it, having a deep relationship with their creator. They were like, okay, the dogma is not lining up.
Would this have been in the Renaissance?
Yes. So rather than attack, they redefined. They started working from within. All right. And so he was called out a couple times for like, okay, heresy, but he was always able to dial it back to, I'm just studying the people that predicted the birth of Jesus. I just want to know. But I think deep down he had a thirst for knowledge. I think he could see that there was something deeper going on here and that he wanted to know more about it. And he utilized the technical aspect, okay, of the Hermetica. There's a book called The Picatrix, and this is full of technical information on how to make talismans based on certain planetary alignments and all this. I have a copy of it. It's extremely challenging to read, and if you are not well versed in alchemy and astrology, you're probably not going to be able to understand it, which is a big part of this kind of information because it's almost like intentionally veiled.
Yeah.
And if you're not an initiate, it's going to sound like gibberish.
Right.
So he worked with this with many artists, the most notable being Sandro Botticelli. He used this Hermetic application when painting the Minerva and the Centaur, the Birth of Venus, and the Primavera. So this is a practical application of magic, making a complex talisman into these paintings. And they were arranged in a way to transmit healthy, rejuvenating, anti-Saturn qualities.
Wow.
Okay. Ficino's very... has a weird relationship with Saturn. And in his chart, he was dominated by Saturn. And I think that around this time, we viewed Saturn through a very dark lens. I get it. He's a very serious planet. Sometimes his lessons are harsh and, so, I'm working hard myself to find beauty with Saturn. So I understand like the people that are just like trembling, in those properties. So, all the paint and like the timing of the painting and the concept, he was working with these artists to bring down this planetary energy and store it within these paintings. And then everyone that's looking at these paintings is going to be inspired, right? It's going to speak to them in a way, that reading like the philosophical aspect might not. So you can feel so much through painting that you can't through, studying it.
It's so interesting that there were so many people during the Renaissance that were trying to infuse so much knowledge and hidden information into their paintings, and they were trying to elicit these big universal feelings and downloads, and you've got Da Vinci and all of these other people that are very clearly painting with this information in their minds.
Right. And there's all sorts of hidden meaning. Definitely with Da Vinci, we could study that for, months and still not fully understand it. But if you study some of these Hermetic principles, if you start studying just Hermeticism in general, it actually opens your mind up to being able to make some sense of why did he paint it this way, and like
Right.
why were there 12, and why like is there the grail on the table. There's all these things that you might not notice.
Right. Yeah, it's while I was listening to you kind of talk about Ficino, it dawned on me that we are so blessed, and we have to be so grateful to these small handful of men throughout history that have done this work to pass this knowledge on through to us. Because you just get a couple here or there every couple centuries or something that put in this work, and they probably go up against strict authority trying to tell them not to, and all of this. And it's not like you've got hundreds or thousands of people doing this. You literally just have one or two every couple of centuries or every couple of years or something. And then you have someone else a couple years later that'll translate that.
Right.
And then 100 years later,
And
someone
bring it
else.
back up.
And literally, we could count on a hand the number of people that have helped pass this information from ancient Egypt to us now. And we have to be so grateful for those people doing that. It's
Right,
so
because they
wild.
risk their lives
Yeah.
to get us this information. And, I've really been meditating on this, which is, occult being like hidden and secret. And there's a part of me that just hates that. I'm like, I want everybody to be able to learn stuff like this that's going to help them, with the self-realization and mastery and, return their power to them. But I also understand why it had to be secret. And you think about Ficino, if he hadn't done it exactly how he had done it, he would have just been excommunicated, executed. All of his work would have been burned, and it wouldn't have been passed on. So he had to play this game, and he was an insider, and I think he had motives beyond what we know, and I can't possibly know everything about him. This is just how I feel when I was studying his story. I'm just like, wow, this guy was awesome in a lot of ways.
I think you get that with a lot of the famous people back then that had great discoveries. I don't know, a lot of the history off the top of my head as well. But I, wasn't Newton and some of these other people, like they were being fought against by the church and by the authority because they were presenting ideas that went against them. And another thing that I heard last night that I did not know, when we talk about Thoth from Egypt, he is famous for his emerald tablet, which you may have heard before. And I did not know that the first person to translate Thoth's emerald tablet into Latin was Newton.
Into English.
Into English, yeah, was Newton. Isaac Newton was the one who did that. And that kind of blew my mind. Because, and I assume that's probably one of the reasons that he was so hated. And
Well, he was an alchemist.
Right.
And I think some of it he was trying to, work with, like taking it very literally. But we know that with alchemy, as, you can make it like literal, I guess, but it's more of an inner, transformation that we're focused on when we're looking at this from like a spiritual lens. We're not actually trying to turn lead into gold. And I think that honestly, the whole, they're trying to turn lead into gold thing, which is, symbolic,
Right.
was something to turn people away from studying it because it makes them look like an idiot. And you're like, what idiot thinks that they can do that? So it's like, oh, this conspiracy guy, right? And this has always happened throughout history. These people that are interested in some of this stuff, they kind of get mocked and ridiculed for it. They have to hide the fact that they're talking about it. And that sucks, but it's just not for the masses. Esoteric, it's like for the few.
Well, that was one of the things that I learned as well studying this that I didn't catch. If you read Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, evidently in there, one of the ways that Victor Frankenstein gets ridiculed by the townspeople is he's reading Hermetic literature, and they're like, "Oh, you silly! You're just reading that nonsense. That's superstitious craziness."
Right.
And like that's a huge literary book right there that's showing you how the public would just make fun of people that believed in Hermetic ideas.
Right. And to me, maybe I shouldn't take it to, oh, it's a conspiracy, but it feels like a conspiracy. It feels like at some point in history, there was specific people that found this, and they know how to use magic, and they know all about astrology, and they know all about Hermeticism. They know all the stuff, that had been passed down from ancient Egypt. They know what Atlantis is. They don't want you to know it. And so they actually set it up to where in your, as soon as you hear that trigger word, you're like, oh, that's stupid. Oh, that's a conspiracy. I'm not going to go there. That's insane. Like, that's a dead end.
Right.
But if we don't know how to work with this, then we become like victims in this game. But once you have the keys to self-mastery and you know how to utilize magic and you know what magic really is, right? You can take your power back and you now become a player.
Right.
You're not just a piece on the chessboard. Now you have your own game, your own reality, and you rule over that reality.
Yeah.
Right. But I really think that they want that slave race thing. If you know who you are, if you know you're a badass, basically God in human form, if you know that, then you're not going to work these like slave jobs.
Yeah.
Right. You're going to be
just
more
not.
content, raising your family and studying the spiritual truths and working on, like self-mastery and stuff like that. So I think to some extent, the, higher ups that are using this actually against the public with mind control and manipulation and things like that, they don't want us to understand it, because when we all stand up, the chessboard falls and all the pieces, they can't control us anymore.
Right. Well, we have the power to make whatever world we want. And if we don't realize that, then we just continue helping them make the world they want.
Right.
Somebody's making a world that they want, and it's either you or somebody above you. Somebody's doing it, and you're either helping them or you're making your own.
Right.
One way or the other.
So something else with Ficino, and one of the reasons that he pursued this is like he actually believed that Jesus was a magician. And so he was like, well, if Jesus was doing these miracles, if Jesus, was literally, his birth was like foreshadow, like it was prophesized.
Right.
All of these divination things that we're told are evil are all in the Bible. Jesus is laying on hands, he's healing, he's doing alchemy, he's doing all sorts of stuff. So I think that, he felt called to be like Jesus. And that is why he became a magician, because he actually believed that that was really what, the whole Christ story was all about. It was an alchemical story. It was about rising above the material plane, and being able to transmute things into something else. Like if something's undesirable, we can change it into something more desirable through transmutation.
Right.
And this is such a powerful metaphor that can actually be used, with our self-awareness exercises. Like as we are evolving, as people, we can actually change certain aspects of ourselves. If we don't like something, we don't have to be a slave to it. So
Right.
even when, thinking about things like astrology, like, the transits are happening. Okay. And if you're aware of them, then you can work with that energy, right? And you can say, I know that this is going to happen, or something around this is going to happen, so I'm going to do something different.
Right.
Because you have like insight into it. And so this is why I feel like they didn't want you to know any of that, right?
Right.
And thinking too about like, these axes in astrology and like the light and shadow attributes of things. Like if we're really studying ourselves and we are looking at, okay, I'm an Aries sun, I know I'm impatient, all these negatives about, the Aries energy. If we know the light and dark aspects of something, then we, through, this is the principle of polarity, can actually lean in to the
Right.
other side of it and manifest the highest form of that sign. But if we don't know what the signs are, we don't know what astrology is, we don't know how to work with it. It's just some, occult like,
Right.
it's literally just, it's so disempowering not to understand
Yeah, it is.
how it's impacting us. And it's happening around us, but we get to choose, right? Because we know. But if you don't know, then you're just getting drilled with some of these transits, because you're not going to know, okay, I probably need to make some sacred space right now.
Right. Well, using Mercury, which we're currently in a Mercury retrograde, and, you and I talk about astrology and this stuff all the time, so we're constantly aware of what's happening. But because of that, whenever I have a program on the computer that doesn't load, or whenever the software just crashes, or whenever I say something to you or someone else in the family or something and they don't hear it right, instead of getting real upset or, bothered or something, I am able to pretty quickly remind myself that, we're in Mercury retrograde, things like this happen, and it keeps me from letting it overwhelm me.
Right.
Just trying to upload the last episode of the podcast, one of the programs that I use just wouldn't open, and I have no idea why. And instead of getting upset or letting it bother me, I just shifted to a different program.
Right.
And it opened just fine in that, and I just kept going, and I just completely relate it back to, well, that was probably Mercury retrograde. Like,
right.
Don't let it bother you, but if you weren't thinking that way and you didn't know about Mercury retrograde and what that might entail, then you might instantly get fired up and be like, oh my God, why isn't this working? And,
right.
And it can totally overwhelm you. And that's just a small area. And it's funny that it's Mercury, and that's what we're talking about.
Right.
But that's one of the examples, just by knowing about it, it can help you. It doesn't keep it from happening.
Right.
But you remind yourself, like, oh yeah, this is part of it. I need to back off.
I don't have to react.
Right.
Or
right. It's not going to control me.
I can react in a different way that is more desirable to my higher purpose.
Right.
Or
I can, work with it and be like, okay, this way of communicating isn't working.
Right.
I need to alter my communication and try it a different way. Mm-hmm. Or try a different piece of tech, or slow down. Sometimes you get going too fast. It all helps to remind you of it.
It's funny because, like, you're just sitting here talking. I'm trying not to jump ahead and talk about the principles too much yet. And I'm just there in your story.
They're everywhere.
The principle of vibration. Like, you can feel yourself getting flustered, because that is what's occurring in that moment. You can feel it, but you can choose to keep your vibration in place with what you want. You don't actually have to start screaming and hollering and throw your laptop.
Right, exactly.
You can say, I'm really frustrated right now. I'm going to try to focus on what I can control, right? And not let yourself just be like this victim of the circumstance.
Right. And that's one of the things that I think, if you're going to play out the idea that there are forces at work that don't want us to be empowered, they want those frustrated feelings. They want us to feel helpless.
Right, because that keeps us in a low vibration.
Right.
And we cannot access the higher wisdom, the higher self, when we are low and depressed and in fear and frustrated and pissed.
Think there's nothing we can do about it.
It literally keeps us in such a dense place that we can't rise above that physical plane at all, and we're not connecting to our spiritual self.
Right.
Right. And what can we do? What can we work with to hack these physical material things? This is where Mercury comes back in, because we can affect them with our thought, with our mind.
Right.
So we're like, physically this is happening, but mentally I'm going to choose not to respond. Right. And then the mind acts as a bridge to the spiritual self. And it says, what does my higher self want? Mm-hmm. But without the mind, you can't get there.
Right.
You have to work your way up. So the physical plane, in a way, can feel a lot like hell, right? And this is like when you think of the cross that Jesus is crucified on. The cross is like mind over matter.
Right.
And so you're stuck in this density. You're stuck in this material plane. How do you get out? Mind. And then when you start working on the mind and you change the way you're thinking, you start changing the books that you're reading. You start changing how you're speaking about yourself. You see, then you start rising above the mind into the higher spheres, into the spirit.
Yep.
And now all three of these things can work together, and we can be fully embodied. Our spiritual self, our mental self, and our physical self are now merged.
And that's exactly how Hermes, or Mercury, goes between the lower world and the upper world.
Right.
Just in the myths. I mean, that's exactly what he does.
Right.
He travels between.
Right. And a lot of the, in the Emerald tablets, the ones that were translated by the Dorial figure, and I don't exactly know how legit those are, but when I was reading those, Thoth is describing like the Merkaba and how to travel between, like he's actually instructing you on traveling, which is so interesting because Mercury is also the god of travel. Right. So it's literally like, teaching you like astral projection.
And supposedly this is wisdom that has come from Atlantis and come from pre-Diluvian civilizations.
This is ancient wisdom. So
right.
Thoth,
he's known as the Atlantean.
Right. Thoth was initially in his carnation an Atlantean, and he existed in Atlantis and then after.
Right. Okay? And brought that wisdom with him.
And held it because he, I think that everybody knew that was going to happen. It's just a part of the cycle. Okay. Right. So once the flood happened, he emerged, in many different forms as a shapeshifter with this wisdom to help sort of get humanity kickstarted back up.
Right.
Because unlike some of the other gods, Mercury has a soft spot for humans. Without Enki, right? Right. Humans would have stayed in that slave kind of like state. Enlil was very upset that Enki had given humans, that spark, that fire that was going to, light up that spiritual essence within them. And now they can start asking questions. And now they can, reason. And now that they can think for themselves. And now they can change reality. And now they can manifest a whole new world. Enlil was like, I just wanted some slaves to do my stuff.
Well, somebody heard that and said, whoa. We don't want them doing that. We got to slave them back up a little bit.
Right.
And that's where they took that knowledge and tried to conceal it back because some power does not want us to be quite that enlightened. It seems. I'm just saying.
So let's talk a little bit about some of the Hermetic doctrines and ideas and things like that. So there is this concept of the Prisca Theologia, and I might be saying that wrong, and this is the doctrine that a single true theology exists, that it exists in all religions, and that it was given to man in antiquity. So, and this is, I think, what Ficino had noticed, like, oh, wow, this is a continuation. This is the same story. This is happening again. All of these beings carry this wisdom. And so this is similar to like the Baha'i faith. And it's interesting because the Baha'i and the Muslims have their own interpretation of Hermes Trismegistus, and they call him Idris. And they actually have wisdom. Some of these Hermetic, Hermetic stuff within their own books, right? So he's acknowledged. And if you think about like the Baha'i, I mean, that's literally what they're doing. They're like merging all of these beliefs, and they're saying it's all one. So that's the thing with the Hermeticism, is that it's all about the all. It's unnameable. It's unknowable. Everything's in the all, right? There's nothing that's not part of the all.
Right.
So every small aspect that's created out of the all has the all within it, yet the all is beyond all of that. And, there's all sorts of deities and gods that, could come out of the all, but it's not the all.
Right.
Because the all is unknowable, it's unnameable, it's unperceivable. But it's fun to study all of the expressions and forms because we are learning and growing, and we are evolving ourselves.
Right.
As we work on the self-mastery, we evolve our consciousness. And when we reincarnate, we, can incarnate in a better place this time.
Right.
In a higher sphere.
I think we're making great strides scientifically to prove this exact theory. You look at Nassim Haramein and some of the work that he's been doing with the space between things. I don't know exactly what it's called, but
where he's like, the universe is 99.9999999% space. I can hear him say it in my head because I just love this.
And the thing is on the quantum level, when you look at this quantum physics and stuff, when you get down to the quantum level, there is no dividing line between things. The solid world, the material world that we see and experience is not truly solid. Mm-hmm. It's not physical. There's huge space between these atoms and these electrons and neutrons and protons, and they're all rotating around each other huge distances apart. And there's no border between my arm and this couch. Mm-hmm. If you zoom in, you can't tell where it ends and begins.
Right.
We're all connected in this field of consciousness, and there's almost to the point of proving it that there is no difference between it, and that's the all.
Right.
And so there can be all sorts of things that exist inside this. There could even be beings that have superpowers that we would call gods. Things that could manifest things or move objects around or bend reality to their will. But in the end, they're still a part of this grand field that we're all existing in. And that's the all.
That's the all.
That's the all. And it's that.
And honestly, the separateness is Maya. It's a part of the great illusion.
Yeah, an illusion.
And I think that illusion's necessary because this idea of separateness forces us to work from this individual perspective, which is so cool. Because as humans, evolve, the all evolves, right?
Right.
And humans are sort of, kind of evolving up into gods in a lot of ways.
Yeah, in a long roundabout way.
Right. All right. Some other things with Hermeticism is what we call the Great Hermetic Confusion. And this confuses people because it's the concept that God is monotheistic, polytheistic, and pantheistic. And this throws a lot of people off because they're like, well, how can it be all?
Right.
And just like we were talking about, well, it's because it's all coming from the mind of God, and therefore there's one. Yeah. Or there's also many, because there's many manifestations of the all. And then the whole pantheistic belief that the reality universe and the cosmos are all identical with divinity in some way. So it's when you're thinking about the all, it all becomes relevant. And the cool thing is that with this kind of philosophy, it tears down the borders.
Yeah.
And it's like, well, you're right. And I would love to study your thing too. And here's my thing. And we can study this. It's cool that you're polytheistic. It's cool that this person's monotheistic. Yeah. Because it's all expressions of the all. Right. The nous, the mind of God, the divine reason of all things, the illuminating idea. It's all happening within the nous.
Right. I think it also helps me a lot with fear, because it really doesn't matter what you encounter. It's just a different reflection of you. And even if that feels like you've encountered a god, if you were to come across some being or some supernatural force or something that's out there, and it feels malevolent to you, or it feels far more powerful than you could ever imagine, ultimately, if you adhere to this belief, that it's still just a part of the all, the grand universe. And, the same way that you and I are the same and we're connected, you and whatever other beings out there are connected. If there are aliens above the earth, we are the same as them. We are all a part of it, all together. And so it to me, it helps with a lot of any sort of fear, because, it doesn't matter what's out there or what happens to you. It's all just a part of you in some way. Right.
And, this is interesting when thinking back to Ficino, where he's like, it's this dogma that has gotten in the way because originally it was the all. Mm-hmm. And now we have a dogma which has created division, separation, and actually disconnected us from the all. And now we just have this dogma, which is missing the life force of the all. It's just, they've tried to sever it from the all and say that divinity is something outside of you. Right. And this is the whole idea of the Renaissance, is a personal relationship with the divine, that the divine moves through us. And this is a rebirth, right, of stepping away from, okay, the church tells me what to do, or some priest tells me what to do, but like, I have control over this reality to a certain extent. So does everybody else, and the divine principle exists within me, and it exists within you. And then now we can actually all love each other. And you see what I mean? Like, when I think about like the law of one and things like that, I've studied like some Rudolf Steiner, and like he goes into Lemurian Atlantis and stuff like that. And they were very much based around the law of one. Mm-hmm. And that sounds a lot like Hermeticism, doesn't it?
Yeah.
With the all. And these cultures were able to live in harmony with nature and and connect to the all, and they were literally so tuned in that they were getting, these deities were able to interact with them. They were able to see them. Like, we can't even see them anymore because we are so disconnected from our spirit.
Right. Hey, as you said that, it made me think, this concept means that not only are me and you one, but we are the same as everything you see. It is all a field of consciousness, and there is no separation. So that would be the trees, the rocks, the sticks, everything.
And the things that we can't see.
Yeah.
Because there's so many other planes and realms within the all. Millions and millions and millions of planes that we'll never be able to see. It doesn't make them less real. They're all a part of the all.
Right. And if you fully adhered to that, then you would treat all of creation with reverence.
Yeah.
And so that's where you would come across these older peoples that you're talking about, and like the way they lived and the way they believed, because you would treat all of nature and all of creation with this reverence.
Right.
The same that you'd think, oh, I just got to treat my neighbor that way because we're one. But it's everything. You treat it all with reverence, and you take care of it and appreciate it.
Right. And at the end of the day, as much as I want to like complain about the toxicity and division that certain religions have forced upon us. Okay, Aquarius rising. Thinking about the principle of rhythm, which we'll get into later, that pendulum swing back and forth. Mm-hmm. So at one point, in our human history, we were all the way on that other part of the spectrum, fully immersed into the spiritual world. Mm-hmm. And at this point in history, that pendulum has swung completely opposite polarity over here. And we are so in the material world that most people, they don't even realize that there's other worlds out there.
I know.
Beyond just, I go to work, I eat McDonald's, or I, fast food or whatever. I pick my kid up from school. They're on this wheel.
Right.
And they're so stuck in that material plane, like their desire is, one day I want to get a fancy car, so I'm going to work 20 years to get a Ferrari. And then but is that even satisfying? But because I understand these principles, I know that, okay, we went all the way this way, we went all the way that way. And at some point it's going to have to come back into a balanced state. And so that gives me a little bit of hope. That within these extremes, there's actually like a beautiful place of peace in between, where we have our reason, and we do have the material plane. The material plane has so much beautiful things. We can create so much here, but then we'll also have this connection to the spiritual planes, right?
What's that middle path?
It's the middle path.
That's what you're supposed to follow.
Right. And I think it's these extremes that help you understand like the importance and value of the middle path more. Mm-hmm.
You think that's what's happening in the wider political spectrum right now, is it's just so polarized it's swinging back and forth so bad.
It's set up to be that way.
Right. But it helps illuminate how the middle path is by far the way that you should go.
Right.
Because both extremes and all polarities are terrible options. So they're just too extreme. And that, I guess that plays out on every level.
Every level.
Hence that it's hidden knowledge here that
Right. Because if you can get caught up in these extremes, you're more controllable.
Right.
You know, a religious fanatic can be totally controlled by whatever a priest says. Like if their guru tells them to go harm somebody, they will have to. Or, you know, these political people, like they'll do whatever. You know, if someone tells them to do that, you know what I'm saying? Like it's
And they have no.
When you are dealing with fanaticism, you have lost control. You
Yeah.
are fully, you know, worshiping the person telling you what to do, that's feeding you the ideas. And this could be like the news or whatever, you know, like,
Right.
and they will pull you into these fanatical states because that's going to keep you in a really low vibration.
Right.
And you can't be at peace in a fanatical place because there's always going to be an other.
Right.
That's, you know, you're the good guy and they're the bad guy. And that's, you know, not
Well, that's the polarity.
right.
And it would, you know, the more that you fight against something, the more you're going to create the opposite. The more you're going to create your own resistance.
Right. And this is another reason why studying these principles is so valuable.
Yeah.
Because we can catch ourselves and be like, oh, I'm being led to this extreme. And I don't really want to live in extremes.
Yeah. I don't have to respond like this. I'm going to take the peaceful, neutral middle path.
Right.
And then your resistance slowly falls away.
Right.
And you don't have somebody fighting against you as much.
Right. And it's like you can rebel when necessary, but you don't always have to, you
Right.
know?
You have to know that you have the power to change what you want to change, and you don't fight against the other stuff or live in that vibration of fear and doubt.
Right. And this is something I think Ficino did really well. So rather than attacking, he redefined. He started working from the inside. He started planting seeds, you know, within the culture and things like that, because he knew he couldn't resist the church.
Right.
And what's the point? It's just going to create fanaticism. So he was like, let's do it a different way,
Yeah.
you know, and that's so cool.
So what happened to the knowledge from Ficino to now?
So, you know, there kind of was this, okay, Renaissance was great. We had all this magic. We had all this literature. And then it kind of died down. And then at the turn of the century, we had a sort of new, like, mini Renaissance. And this information came back up again, right? Just in time to inspire the next generation.
It's funny how that happens.
Right. And so we had people like Helena Blavatsky, Carl Jung,
Manly P. Hall.
well, he's a little after this, but he was inspired by it.
Okay.
Rudolf Steiner. And these people were bringing this wisdom back to the forefront. And it's, you know, it's beautiful. And it, you know, it kind of maybe ended after around the stock market crash, I think. And that's kind of what happens. Like people get depressed and like
Well,
beauty
you slip
and
into
all
survival
that.
mode.
Right. And that's actually a natural thing
Yeah.
that happens. And we know by studying polarity that someone that has these extremes, like, so if you're having a lot of happiness and beauty, it's the pendulum will swing the other way.
Yeah.
So I feel like I feel like the cycles have sped up. Right. So we don't have to wait so long for these things to come back around. And I feel like, you know, even right now, it's coming back up. Like you can order this book on Amazon now, like this super secret hidden information that, you know, was withheld from the public for all this time. You had to be an initiate. You had to be, you know, it had to be passed down from a teacher to you, you know, and all that. All that is not as necessary anymore. You know, we have access to this. So if we're a seeker, we can find it. You know, we don't have to wait multiple lifetimes for a guru to appear.
Right.
You know, we can start working on ourselves at any point. And that's so cool because, you know, even in that mini Renaissance, you know, maybe you didn't have access to books or whatever. Right. It still might have been more of, okay, the rich people, the elite people that have time to read, you know, not everybody has that space. But now it's like, you know, you can buy the Kybalion for $5 on Amazon and like sit with it and reread it and meditate on it and start implementing these practices. And I feel like that's a beautiful place to be too, you know, and people are starting, you know, I'm seeing more art. I'm seeing more people like wanting to write poems and things again. So it's just a natural thing. Like we go through dark times and then it's going to be followed by beauty and peace and, people wanting to think about like philosophy and wordplay and
Right. I thought it was
all the Venusian stuff.
right. I thought it was interesting to find out that the first Hermetic book that was written and translated in the late 1800s, and this was after like 4 centuries of nothing. It was done by Blavatsky's secretary. I thought that was super fascinating. And then just a few years later is when the Kybalion showed up, which is what we're going to dig into in the next episode. But I guess we should talk a little about the Kybalion and the author and where it came from and how it just popped up.
Okay, so when you buy the book, The Kybalion, it's going to say that it's, by the 3 initiates. And for a long time, I just was like, okay, don't really know who the author of this is. And then one day I was watching Mitch Horowitz talk about the Kybalion, and he has so much information on this book. He has, I don't know if he made the documentary by himself. He might have worked with other people, but there is a documentary that he helped produce on the Kybalion. And, he's done a lot of research and has proved that it was definitely authored by William Walker Atkinson, and it was done solo.
Okay.
I personally think he might have been channeling the records a little bit just because of the language that he's using is very similar. And he was studying a lot of this wisdom, and the records are in every culture, like every wisdom cult around the world knows what their Kardec records are.
Right.
So I think he was probably consulting them. He was probably inspired by studying, some of these Hermetic texts, and then went on to write this. I think, he wrote many books. I don't know the exact number, but he was a huge person in like the thought movement. So like now we have, The Secret, or like the Tony Robinson, or like Joe Dispenza
Right.
and all this. And if you want to go back, they probably all read the Kybalion, or they've studied, Hermeticism.
Right.
Which all comes back into the mind. It's all in the mind.
It's all in the mind,
And that there's power there. So he really brought this back up. And the cool thing is he's not just sharing the axioms, which are very important, but he's also kind of helping interpret them in like layman's terms. And I think a lot of times when we study these things, because it's so encoded, it just feels like, I'm never going to get this. I don't understand what this means. And so he has that axiom there. He has the principle. And then he's going to give you some really like, tangible wisdom to help explain that in a deeper way, which is really cool. So he was a lawyer, but in his free time, he was an occultist, and he had his own publishing company. And yeah, he brought a lot of this kind of wisdom forward. I think there's the book, The Arcane Teachings, which has, 4 books within it. And a lot of it is just based around mentalism and the astral planes and things like that. I mean, it's really cool to study him. I haven't fully immersed myself into him. I've mostly been focusing on the Kybalion, but he's a really cool figure and worthy of some, exploration and like a deeper analysis of his work.
Definitely. I mean, just this book alone, it feels like it is an ancient work that was rediscovered. More than just something that he wrote himself, which I guess is why you would think that the records were involved, because it just doesn't seem like something that this guy just
he
wrote.
obviously didn't come up with the Hermetic Principles on his own.
Right, yeah.
But I think what he authored was the analysis of each of them. That's the thing that he wrote.
Yeah.
And he brought the principles forward to where almost everybody's heard of As Above, So Below. You know, it's kind of everywhere. But like the thing is that when you're studying someone like Joe Dispenza, you're going to get all the cool the magic of it, but you're not going to know where it came from.
Yeah.
Right. And it's just focused mostly on the mentalism aspect. Right. So this is really cool because you can go all the way back and study all the principles all together and then utilize them as needed.
I think that helps provide a better understanding of them anyway, because, you know, as above, so below, it's pretty and poetic, and like you can kind of understand it, but without some of the other ones and it all going together and doing further elaboration, it just feels a little empty, and it certainly isn't going to impact your life the way that it could, you know, if you fully understand all of the principles.
Right, because then if you really understand it, because it's the all, you'll see it in all things.
Right.
You'll see it in all actions. You'll see it in all thought. I mean, it's literally like everywhere, which is really cool. But you have to be pretty grounded in the principles before you can start seeing them out in the real world. So let's go ahead and wrap this one up.
Okay.
And get started on the next episode where we will go over each of the principles individually and just talk about how, you know, we've been able to work with these principles in our lives.
That sounds good. I'm excited for it.
All right. Well, thank you so much for joining me.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for having me on here. I get excited every time and more comfortable being your guest on here.
Yes, thank you. And thank you all for tuning in. Check us out next time on the Astral Hour.
Whoa.